Hello and welcome to the special coverage of the 2018 Inter-Korean Summit. I'm Jae-in in Seoul. The leaders of the two Koreas stepped into a new future today as President Moon Jae-in and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un met face-to-face for the very first time and declared an official end to the Korean War. From the moment they met and shook each other's hands at the military demarcation line to eating dinner together with first ladies on their sides, the day was filled with many firsts. First, that will hopefully lead to a permanent peace on the Korean peninsula. And before we take a closer look at the joint statement with our experts, let's first head over to our Devin Whiting at the News Center for a look at some reports by our Arirang reporters that cover the historic summit today. Hello, Devin.
Hi, Jae-in. An historic day indeed, and one that ended in spectacular style with the farewell ceremony we just watched. President Moon and Kim Jong-un parted ways just about half an hour ago. Earlier in the evening, they signed a joint declaration, the Panmunjom Declaration, which officially ends all hostilities between the two sides. Our Hwang Ho-jun has the latest from the Panmunjom press pool.
A farewell ceremony for the visiting North Korean leader was held on Friday night just outside the Peace House, the main venue for Friday's historic summit meeting. President Moon and Kim Jong-un watched a video together projected onto the facade of the Peace House. The theme of the video, a new spring enjoyed together. And with that, President Moon bid farewell to his North Korean counterpart. The ceremony took place immediately after the welcoming dinner hosted by the South Korean president at the Peace House in honor of the visiting North Korean leader. As expected, Kim Jong-un's wife Ri Sol-ju and South Korea's First Lady Kim Jong-suk both attended the feast, along with high-ranking officials from both Koreas. The dinner kicked off with a series of performances and dishes from the hometowns of President Moon Jae-in, the late South Korean presidents Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun. Even food from Switzerland, where Kim Jong-un spent part of his childhood, and the renowned Pyongyang-style naengmyeon, or cold noodles, were served as well. But of course, the highlight of the day came when the joint declaration was made by the two leaders, the Panmunjom Declaration. For the first time in history, President Moon and Kim Jong-un held a joint press conference after signing that document. President Moon and Kim both declared there will no longer be war on the Korean peninsula and a new era of peace has begun. They pledged to cooperate to de-escalate military tension by halting all aggression in any form and to realize a complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula.
오늘 김정은 위원장과 나는 완전한 비핵화를 통해 핵 없는 한반도를 실현하는 것이 우리의 공동 목표라는 것을 확인했습니다.
이토록 지척에 살고 있는 우리는 대결하여 싸워야 할 이민족이 아니라 단합하여 화목하게 살아야 할 한 핏줄을 이은 한 민족입니다.
The agreement also says the two leaders will seek to make an official declaration of the end of war within this year. The two Koreas technically remain at war, as the Korean War, which happened in 1950 to 1953, ended with an armistice, not a peace treaty. A reunion of separated families will also take place in this coming August 15th, and President Moon will pay a return visit to Pyongyang this fall. Hwang Ho-jun, Arirang News.
When President Moon and Kim Jong-un first met this morning, it was in front of all the press, and their first sit-down discussion included many of their top aides. But in the afternoon, they got some time to speak one-on-one, and they did that while taking a walk around the grounds of Panmunjom. They also planted a tree together, symbolizing peace and the mutual prosperity of South and North. Our Kwon Jang-ho has more on the events of this afternoon.
First on the agenda in the afternoon was the planting of a commemorative tree. Shortly before 4:30 p.m., President Moon Jae-in emerged from the Peace House at Panmunjom. He eschewed the red carpet and motorcade and walked to the tree with his advisors. Meanwhile, Kim Jong-un turned up in a black limousine with his security personnel running alongside. After another quick handshake, the two leaders each picked up a shovel and completed the planting of a pine tree with soil from Paektu Mountain in North Korea and from Halla Mountain in South Korea's Jeju Island. Pine trees hold an auspicious place in Korean history, representing peace and prosperity, and this one itself was originally sown in 1953, the year that hostilities ended in the Korean War. Kim offered a few comments before they continued to water the tree, again with water from rivers in the Koreas. A monument commemorating the occasion was unveiled with the words, "Here we plant peace and prosperity." Then they took a short stroll towards a footbridge where they looked at an old signpost that marked the military demarcation line before they sat down together at a table. The cameramen that had followed them were shooed away before they engaged in talks lasting some 30 minutes. This was the opportunity for the two leaders to have a frank discussion away from other officials and the press. What did the leaders talk about? That we may never know. The two leaders then walked back to the Peace House to continue their afternoon summit talks. Kwon Jang-ho, Arirang News.
And the day began with a moment that will long be remembered. Millions of people were watching this morning as Kim Jong-un became the first North Korean leader to step foot on South Korean soil since the war ended. And in an unexpected gesture, he invited President Moon to step over briefly onto the North Korean side. Our Park Ji-won has the highlights from the morning session.
President Moon Jae-in greets North Korean leader Kim Jong-un at the military demarcation line at Panmunjom, the truce village that straddles the inner Korean border. At 9:30 a.m. South Korea time, the two leaders shook hands and Kim took a historic step forward onto South Korean soil. It was the first time a sitting North Korean leader had stepped foot on South Korean territory in nearly 70 years. Kim took President Moon's hand and invited him to the northern side, and the South Korean leader stepped over into the north. After exchanging a few pleasantries, Kim Jong-un was greeted by a guard of honor laid on by the South Korean military. President Moon told Kim if he visits Cheongwade, South Korea's presidential office, he could see a full guard of honor. Kim replied that he'd visit Cheongwade anytime if invited. The two leaders began their summit talks from 10:15 a.m. at the Peace House in Panmunjom. President Moon was accompanied by Presidential Chief of Staff Im Jong-seok and National Intelligence Service Chief Seo-hoon, while Kim Jong-un was joined by his sister Kim Yo-jong and North Korea's ceremonial leader Kim Young-nam. Their morning meeting lasted for about an hour and 40 minutes, wrapping up at 11:55 a.m. South Korea time when the two sides broke for lunch. Kim Jong-un and the other North Korean delegates headed back to the North Korean side for a bit to eat, bringing a successful end to the morning session of the historic summit. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, other countries have been quite supportive of today's summit between the two Koreas. President Trump, cautiously optimistic, praise but measured from Japan. China has called it an historic step toward peace. Jo Sung-min reports.
International powers and nations neighboring the Korean peninsula have swiftly reacted to the outcome of the third Inter-Korean summit on Friday. Congratulatory messages and hopes to see strengthened inter-Korean ties were among the top statements. U.S. President Donald Trump tweeted that good things are happening between the two Koreas after a series of nuclear testing and missile launches in the past year. Trump, however, also warned that only time will tell. Russia praised the historic summit between Seoul and Pyongyang by saying the Panmunjom Declaration is a positive result. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said Moscow has been supportive of the idea of South Korean President Moon Jae-in and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un meeting to solve out issues. When he was asked about Russia's view on Kim meeting U.S. President Trump, he replied Moscow welcomes any steps that would de-escalate tensions on the Korean peninsula. China welcomed Friday's Inter-Korean summit by applauding the two leaders for taking a historic step toward peace. Beijing's foreign ministry spokesperson Hua Chuning quoted a famous line from a Chinese writer to address that today's historic meeting could open a new stage for lasting peace and stability on the peninsula.
There's a poem in China, brotherhood remains after going through all hardship, and all debts of gratitude and hatred from the past vanish with a smile when we meet. We hope and expect this historical meeting in Panmunjom can be an opportunity to further open a new era of lasting peace and stability on the peninsula.
Japan also welcomed the outcome of the summit in Panmunjom, but said it wishes to see North Korea take firm actions that reflect the agreement. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said he expects concrete steps to be taken by Pyongyang towards carrying out the conditions.
I strongly hope North Korea will take concrete action following this meeting and through the summit meeting with the United States. I will keep a close watch on North Korea's future conduct.
Abe also mentioned that Tokyo will closely work with Seoul and Washington ahead of the unprecedented meeting between Kim and Trump, expected to take place in late May or early June. Jo Sung-min, Arirang News.
I'm Devin Whiting. Do stay tuned as our summit coverage continues.
No more war on the Korean Peninsula and working together to achieve complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. These are what came out of today's historic summit between South Korean President Moon Jae-in and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, as they agreed to seek a permanent and solid peace on the peninsula. However, some say that today's agreement between the two Koreas isn't too surprising, and that success of the summit will basically come down to what the two Koreas are able to achieve next, as Kim Jong-un is expected to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump for the very first time sometime in May or June. And to talk to us more about today's summit and what came out of it all, Professor Song Se-ryun of Kyung University and Dr. James Kim, a research fellow at the Asa Institute for Policy Studies, join us in the studio today. Welcome, Professor Song. Welcome, Dr. Kim.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so the two leaders signed and announced the Panmunjom Declaration for peace, prosperity, and unification of the Korean Peninsula. Now, what can we make of this title, the Panmunjom Declaration?
Well, Panmunjom, this was a historic day in many regards. At the historic site, Panmunjom, of course, is the site where the armistice was signed at the end of the Korean War. So there is a historical significance and provided a venue where for the first time, North Korean leader kind of stepped into this South Korean side. So that's another first. But I think you have to look at it from another angle, which is that the Panmunjom Declaration is at the end of a long series of other declarations. There was 615 in 2000 and 10-4 in 2007. And they're a result of six-party talks, a couple of agreements as well. So this is a continuation of those kind of long trend in talking about key issues.
No,
I'll just like to add to what Professor Song just said. As Professor Song mentions, we have a tendency in South Korea to associate these important agreements or occasions on dates.
Okay.
And they're often referred to as numbers.
Right.
And this is a very unique moment where the Moon administration and North Korean regime decided to actually give a significance to the place where this occurred. And to that extent, I think it's somewhat important. And if you look in history in other places where important agreements happen, for instance, in places like Bretton Woods, for instance, there's a tendency for other Western nations to put significance on that place.
Right.
So I think it's important to note that there's a recognition here about the importance of where this occurred, and that that place, as Professor Song talked about, carries a lot of meaning and symbolism. And today, clearly the summit was filled with many different types of symbols and meanings.
Right.
And these two leaders were not only talking orally and speaking out and in writing, but they were also showing the world through their action and also these symbols. And clearly, Panmunjom has that kind of significance here. And I think going forward and several years from now, looking back in history, I think President Moon would like the people of the world to remember this particular moment when it happened in Panmunjom.
Right, instead of April 27th agreement, I guess. All right, now, I think what was notable is that the two leaders announced a joint statement together for the very first time. Now, what significance does this carry?
Well, that's another first time as well. And as Dr. Kim mentioned, it was preceded by a lot of firsts, and we saw the optics of, what you call it, bromance or the charm offensive. It seems like those things that we have never seen, those two leaders holding hands together and very intimate.
Right.
So whether it be symbolism or something substantive about it, there was a significant kind of showing of two leaders. As you mentioned, it's the devil is in the details. What follows from this great beginning or the romance I think that'll determine the outcome.
For me, that was one of many memorable moments today, obviously. And the other one that I could think of was that 30-minute, off in the distance, very intimate moment that the two men had together on the bridge.
Yeah.
They clearly wanted to stage that and show the world that they were having a very private discussion, but the world gets to see, but not hear what they're saying.
Right.
It was, but these moments largely played into Kim Jong-un's favor more so than it did for Moon Jae-in.
I think so too.
Because people have seen Moon Jae-in before. They have heard him speak in public. So he is a very, he is a known quantity here for a lot of the viewers.
Yeah.
But not too many people have heard Kim Jong-un actually speak.
Right.
Nor have they seen him, what his mannerisms are. There was more attention and focus on what Kim Jong-un was saying, what he did. He was clearly the center of everybody's attention today. And given that these are first moments where Kim Jong-un is making himself available to the world, I think this was a charm offensive that worked to Kim Jong-un's favor, where he now becomes the influencer and the agenda setter for today's talks.
All right, and I think it really showed unity too, what Kim Jong-un said in the joint statement about a united Korea where we're tied with blood, that kind of stuff. It kind of shows how they were jointly doing all this together.
Right, and that was emphasized all throughout the declaration today. If you take a look at the declaration, the joint statements in '92, 2000, 2007, compared to 92 and 2000, I think this was longer, but it's a little shorter than the 2007 agreement.
Okay.
But there's more substance there. And one of the three things that they emphasized was this nationhood, the sense of nationhood and blood tie and unity. So some people look at this and say, what does this mean? Does this mean autonomy, that South Koreans are going to decide their own fate for themselves? So maybe some outsiders are looking at this and kind of saying, what does this mean? Do the two Koreas want to ignore the rest of the world? Do they want to ignore the other stakeholders in the region?
Right.
I'd like to take a positive look at it and interpret it in a way that says, we consider ourselves with similar language, with similar history. We have a very difficult past, but we want to get over that. And so I think it was a positive message overall.
A positive message, but I agree with you. It was a major scoring moment for the Kim Jong-un because, North Korea was considered to be a terrorist rogue nation, not even a nation under the Korean constitution, but being equal with President Moon Jae-in, standing side by side, and with enough folksiness, with the charming. I think this was a moment where he kind of elevated the North Korea, whether they deserve it or not.
Showing that North Korea is a normal state indeed. Now, all eyes were on how the two Koreas would address North Korea's nuclear issue. And we heard that the two sides agreed to work for complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. Now, let's break this down further.
Maybe Professor Song has a legal interpretation of this. Well, let me try on this one. So, the Blue House, for the longest time, has been focused on the issue of complete denuclearization. Yes, President Moon has mentioned the Korean Peninsula component before. Yes, the words verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula was in the six-party talks agreement 2005. Those words are in there. But there's a specific meaning that the North Koreans attribute to the concept of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
Okay.
And that concept essentially is not only about denuclearization of North Korea, but denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula to include the nuclear umbrella, which is part of the U.S.-ROK alliance, so ROK-U.S. alliance. And does this imply a decoupling of the alliance? or doesn't it? I'm not sure.
Okay.
Because President Moon has said this before and his oral statements in the past. As I've mentioned, it was in the six-party talks joint statement. But clearly, I mean, a lot of experts and the North Korea watchers will say that that has a particular meaning, and that maybe North Korea, and it was in the statement that was issued not too long ago, about a week ago, right, in North Korea. So what does this mean exactly? I'm not sure. It's a little bit unclear at the moment for me. Clearly, there was no roadmap on how to achieve this either. So we're nowhere better off today after the issuance of the joint declaration than we were before, which was, you know, we don't know what the intention is here. We don't have clarity. And so on this issue, I don't think we have a resolution or clarity as a result of the summit.
Perhaps do you think the ball has been kind of tossed to the United States because we know that there is a summit coming up between Trump and Kim, and perhaps the two Koreas didn't want to go into too much detail on how to carry out this denuclearization, knowing that the U.S. has a very firm stance on denuclearization?
That interpretation is pretty possible because if Kim Jong-un thinks that there is a deal table prepared with Donald Trump, who professed to be or claimed to be the master of deal making, then he needs some kind of chips. Right. And he doesn't want to show everything that he has. So there is a kind of a calculated murkiness at this point. But this issue of denuclearization, this is not the first time they brought it up. I mean, in the 10-4 agreement, 10-4 declaration, they mentioned this before, and I think the two can readily agree without, you know, contradicting themselves that they all want the complete denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula. But the approaches has been different. North Korea has attached the pull-out of American troops in Korean Peninsula, so that was a kind of deal-breaking moment. And even in the declaration, if you look at Section 3 and 4, so paragraph 4, it talks about complete denuclearization. But if you look at number 2, it says North Korea agreed to carry on disarmament in a phased manner.
Right. That word phased in there.
Phased
is it
in there.
Again? Right.
So again, this is a declaration, not precise in what they mean or what is the application there, but this is a particular method of denuclearization, phased manner. It's something that the United States has specifically said they're not going to go for.
Right.
So I think please.
So it sets up, if that's kind of a sticking point, both the two parties would have pretty different positions.
Well, you know, two things.
Okay.
One, on denuclearization, historically, if you look at the denuclearization process after the Cold War and examples like Ukraine, it cannot be done overnight and it can't be clean denuclearization.
For sure.
Okay, so it takes time for this to happen, and the United States needs to come around to that. Whether they demand it be done within 5 months or 6 months, or whether they demand it to be done in 5 years or 10 years, there's a method that needs to go into that madness. So that's number one. Number two, on the issue of denuclearization as a concept, whether they wanted to clarify this, I think it works in Kim Jong-un's favor, and also President Moon, if they want the U.S. DPRK talks to actually happen sometime either in May or June.
Right.
And the reason why that is because President Trump has already agreed to the talks before knowing what he knows now.
Right.
As a result of this declaration. So, and if we agree to the argument that this declaration has no clarity on the concept of denuclearization, on that particular issue, we're no better off today than we were yesterday.
Okay.
And President Trump already said he was going to sit down with Kim Jong-un and have that talk. He's already tweeted today that he favors what's happened and he supports what's happened here today in Panmunjom. So nothing suggests to me at the moment that the talks between U.S. and North Korea is going to be derailed at this particular juncture.
Okay, but
obviously, but Donald Trump is a big unknown.
Right.
So.
And I mean, he with his tweets and all, we don't know what's going to come from him. But at the same time, what are the chances that we might see North Korea making some demands from here on out in return for a specific denuclearization?
I think it's not just a chance. I think it's a big premise on this. The reason why the phase method is a sticking point is because the giving up of nuclear weapons comes with some kind of price tag, we assume. And that has not been mentioned in this venue because people think that that big deal is going to happen with either with Trump or with China involved. With Korea, we talked about in generalities about economic cooperation, but there is no price tag.
Okay.
And the phased method is, we kind of denigrated with the salami method that North Korea tries to use, try to kind of slice this whole process into so many different phases so that each phase they'll say, well, if you do this, give us this, and so on and so forth. That's why Trump was there, well, complete denuclearization first, and then we'll talk, which I don't think that North Korea will be too happy about. So there is again, the devil is in the details. How do we set this up?
Right.
And
how long is it going to take?
Right.
Also,
and how, in the end, how do we spin it even?
And to the professor's credit, it's interesting to note that the concept of denuclearization is a subcategory under the broader issue of peace.
Right.
And Kim Jong-un and President Moon Jae-in, I think, lays out, gives us a glimpse into the method a little bit, how that salami is going to be cut.
Right.
And on the issue of signing of a peace treaty, they've laid out the possibility of a trilateral
or four-way
negotiation,
talks,
including the U.S., or a quadrilateral, including China.
Right.
And it's obvious why that is, right? You need to have the U.S. and China, who are signatories of the armistice, to declare that it is in fact over, and that you have then all the parties sign a peace treaty of some kind. So I think that first step in that process, I would imagine, would be that that peace be the centerpiece of denuclearization. And it's I don't think it's a coincidence that peace as a new start is the slogan for this particular summit. And it's also all over this declaration. It's in the title, Panmunjom Declaration for Peace, Prosperity, and Unification, right? So I think that this is going to be a long, drawn-out process. It's going to be complex. President Moon will be speaking with President Trump tomorrow morning, I guess, sometime,
and he's
or
going
even
to
tonight
meet
over
with
the phone.
Trump before the Trump-Kim summit, too.
Right, and he's going to be meeting with them. It's going to be diplomacy on hyperdrive before and after the meeting between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. It's going to be very interesting for the coming few months.
Not only that we're gathering all the signatories of the armistice agreement, but I thought that Kim Jong-un going over to China and secure China's hands in this was, I thought was very significant because we're talking about it as a big premise that there is going to be a deal table between the North Korea and United States for easing of the sanctions and all kinds of other things. Now, if the Trump, well, if we know a little bit about his method, he is always kind of tough at first and then kind of ease up to intimidate the other partners.
Well, I didn't mean that.
Right. But expecting that, I think that North Korea desperately needed somebody who can act as a white knight or somebody who can act as a go-to person. And they got it with China, and happily China would oblige because without that, China was facing kind of China passing moment.
All right, so definitely denuclearization is an issue that we need to keep our eyes on, obviously. But let's take a look at some of the other aspects from the joint declaration today. There were quite a lot of agreements made in regards to boosting inter-Korea relations, obviously, and one of them being the establishment of liaison office in Kaesong area. What kind of changes can we expect in this regard with communication between the two Koreas?
These are all important confidence-building measures in many ways in order to prevent miscommunication and misperception so that tensions don't get out of hand if we have a moment where there are, accidental escalation. For instance, you could think of an instance where we've seen that recently with the landmine incidents along the DMZ. Whether that was intended or was an accident, putting that aside, if there was a hotline that was working and some of these kinds of confidence-building measures, maybe things might not have gotten out of hand. So these are good in the sense that it's a means towards keeping tensions low and not going on another escalation ladder and for things to get out of hand. But on things like inter-Korean exchange, whether that be separated families, reunion or academic exchanges that could have happened, these are all good, I think, overall. It doesn't hurt to do this. If anything, I think North Korea would be more concerned about the possibility that this could influence the general population in North Korea and that it could work against the North Korean propaganda.
Right.
But I think these are all hopeful signs that North Korea is making concessions in these regards.
Right. It's a tension diffusing mechanism, but also this is something that they talked about before, intent for a declaration. Out of that, there was a Kaesong economic district and also Kumgangsan tour. And they talked about other things like Haeju and other area that we never got to. So I think that this liaison office is expected to kind of restart maybe Kaesong and Kumgangsan tour and also get to other economic cooperation that they didn't get to.
But there is one potential problem with establishing this in Kaesong, and that is the issue of how do you get around sanctions if you're going to put the money into making something like this, and how do you operationalize that? Part of the reason why I think this particular agreement does not include an element about any discussion about Kaesong and Mount Kumgang is largely because the leaders know that
what the problems are.
What the potential pitfalls are there, and that some real smart diplomacy was required and coordination with the United States on this. So I would imagine that President Moon, one of the discussions that he would be having with President Trump on moving forward up to the June or May or June meeting is to grant him the authority to do some of these things that he's laid out in this declaration while keeping the sanctions in place. Because President Moon has already pledged to agree to the pressure tactic the pressure strategy that the Trump administration wants to keep on. So expect to see some more discussion there, just like the kinds of maneuvers and discussions that we had prior to the Winter Games.
Right. Now, I think another interesting point made here was that the two sides agreed to stop all hostile acts. Now, what do they mean by hostile acts? I mean, like you mentioned before, does this include like U.S. Seoul joint military drills? I mean, those were some of the things that North Korea felt it was, it was really threatened by it and always said, don't do it. But then Seoul and Washington always rejected it, right? So, I mean, what do they mean by hostile acts? And they said they're going to stop all of it.
Right. What's already visible is our loudspeaker propaganda towards North and sending over a lot of little leaflets that have been pushed by some private groups as well So that has presumably stopped, or the government is urging that they to stop. Probably skirmishes that might happen militarily that served as a purpose for military taxes on both sides. Probably they'll be scaled down or stopped as long as this deal goes through. So I think that those skirmishes is something that we know or not know about will probably scale down from a military's point of view.
Right, so those were mentioned in the declaration. In addition, there was mentioning there about safe fishing activities and along the NLL. I think that there are many, many things that could potentially go get a little out of hand. And we've seen a lot of that. They've laid out some of that here in the agreement. You can talk about the possibility of scaling up on the deployment of strategic assets near the peninsula.
Yeah.
Or, as we know, the THAAD battery, which is already here. These are all things that North Koreans have talked about before. And, you know, and they're all variables that can shift depending on how much of a salami piece North Koreans are offering in that round of negotiation. So I think we'll see what all this means as things unfold from here on out.
So we know that the two leaders are going to talk to each other more directly through that hotline, which was established before the summit. And President Moon said that he will be visiting Pyongyang in fall. So are we actually seeing these inter-Korean summits on a regular basis? Are we going to see them on a regularly, I guess?
There seems like an intention in the declaration and the kind of a framework they lay out for communication with the two parties. But I think ultimately the solutions, as you mentioned, even the sanctions, those things that they're talking about, is premised upon the scenario where the talk with Trump goes well and the Trump administration influences the UN side as well. So global community kind of ease up on the sanctions, which depends on a lot of showings on Korean Peninsula. So from that standpoint, I mean, today's very feel-good kind of showing is understandable because there are specific audiences from especially Kim Jong-un's point of view.
Right.
So with that in mind, probably a lot of things that could happen in the future depends on what Trump does and depends on what China does. And it has always been the case.
Right.
China has always been the key. And without the blessing or the cooperation of the United States, nothing has happened so far.
It used to be the case that Kim Jong-un was also a big unknown here, what his intentions were leading up to November of last year. But I think that's a little bit clearer now with all these token gestures that he's shown us today. The first summit and a visit by a North Korean leader to a South Korean soil.
Right.
The first, joint press announcement. A joint declaration. There are a lot of things that we saw today that seems to suggest to me if there's any clarity from this summit, it's less from the declaration than from the actions of Kim Jong-un, which is that he wants to now engage in charm offensive, and he wants to resolve the current escalatory crisis by diplomacy.
Okay.
And that intention is very clear. He's shown that today, and now the question is, as Professor Song pointed out, does Trump want to play, and how's he going to do this? Is he going to be, as he likes to say, the master disruptor before a big negotiation? If that's the case, we're bound to see at least one or two tweets between now and sometime in May or June that gets us all woken up in the morning and open up a newspaper. Oh, he did it again.
What?
So hopefully, we don't have that, and we have a very productive solution and one that is peaceful to this problem. And I hope President Trump is on board with that. But
you never know. I mean, he did say that he's willing to walk away from this summit if he has nothing to get out of it, you know? And he said that he has things to show to his Americans, his people, before the midterm elections and all,
I think
too.
big time because of the elections. I mean, if the midterm elections go terribly wrong or go down for the Republicans, he might be theoretically facing impeachment as well.
Right.
So this is a do or die situation. But let me play a little bit of devil's advocate on the Kim Jong-un issue, because I think it's really fascinating. If this was a drama, this character of Kim Jong-un has become really complicated and interesting. Before, he was a brutal dictator, killing his uncles and doing all kinds of bad things to his people. Now he comes down, he's foxy and he's charming and bringing food to Pyongyang, cold noodles, and talk about peace and the prosperity for all. I mean, it's baffling.
It is.
Which side is true intentions?
Right.
And this is a guy who cried, this is a regime that cried wolf too many times, and there is a good reason for skepticism here. So his showing today made him very, very interesting, but at the same time, the risk is higher whether we believe him or not going forward. I think that all eyes, other than just the interest alone, has to be really keen on the situation in Korean Peninsula.
I don't doubt his intention for a moment here, and I think he is that guy that killed his uncle with the machine gun and developed the nuclear capability, because we are here today because of all of this, right? And so I don't doubt the intention, but what's the reason? Why is he doing this? What's the rationale? And I think, you know, the strategy here is not to escalate further. The strategy is to use diplomacy. And in order to be diplomatically engaging, you have to put your smiley face on. You have to be approachable. You have to be available. And so this is a different kind of approach to dealing with the threats that he's facing, namely the United States and South Korea. So let's see how that plays out.
Do you think sanctions were some of the major pressure that North Korea was feeling that led him to be like this, I guess, all friendly and, you know,
It's a confluence of different factors. I think it's difficult for us to say without getting into Kim Jong-un's head exactly what motivated him to do this. But I could name several potential factors here that I think all contributed. One is obviously the maximum pressure and engagement policy. And that includes not only a course of diplomacy in the form of sanctions, but you also have the President of the United States making very, very contentious statements. You have the deployment of assets that you have not seen before, and the frequency with which they're being deployed. The kind of military threat that North Korea is facing.
especially from the United States.
Right, from the United States. So you have both sanctions, and on the military side, you have not only U.S. posturing against North Korea, but it's Japan and South Korea and China genuinely concerned, right? If you can scare your allies, what does that do to your adversary?
Right.
And I think that it had some impact there. There's also the factor that, you know, he didn't complete his development cycle.
Okay.
Why did he stop just before that last step? Right? It's enough to show his domestic audience that he could declare himself a nuclear state. On the other hand, it's at this particular juncture, I think Gary Seymour said this very nicely, that his leverage is at its maximal point where he can get the most out of the negotiations. So this is a perfect timing for him. It comes right after the November test Then he declares that he's a nuclear state, that he's developed the ICBM capability and the nuclear capability. His adversary is still questioning, because without an atmospheric test, they're not going to believe you.
Right.
But his domestic audience have bought it. And now he wants to negotiate.
Okay.
So he sees a strategy here where diplomacy is going to work to his advantage at its maximal stage. And he also sees the rising threat, which can potentially, make this into a very bad situation for him and his regime.
Right.
I agree. Isn't it interesting that he declares that he's a nuclear state, nuclear power, and then this year, his New Year's message was one part belligerent to U.S., but he sends this love message to South Korea. And that started the whole ball rolling. In 10 days, they had a high-level summit meeting, and in 2 months, there was the
Winter
Korean
Games.
leaders, Winter Games, and our ministers going up to North Korea to talk about the summit, and then that made U.S. summit meeting, North U.S. summit meeting possible. So you can look at it from this angle and say that, well, this is in the old playbook of Kim Jong-un. He waited until he can declare that they're the nuclear power, and then they immediately turn around, and as Dr. Kim said, this is a time to cash out on this.
Well, things are progressing very quickly, but let's go back to the joint statement. I mean, there were some mentions of boosting bilateral economic cooperation between the two countries. Tell us more about this.
Well, I mean, President Moon has laid out towards the November, end of November, actually early November, excuse me, right before the test, through the Ministry of Unification, his policy on North Korea. And one very important component of that policy, which has 3 objectives, 4 strategies, and 5 principles, is an economic cooperation with North Korea. And a lot of that is actually in here, where he talks about the existence of a sort of an eastern economic belt all along North Korea, primarily on energy. Gyeongin Line and the rail line has been discussed before, and also along the west coast, manufacturing belt. Connecting that along the DMZ would be some sort of a tourism belt.
Okay.
So this is all laid out in very nice, fine detail on the Ministry of Unification's website, and you can take a look at that. But in order to do that in North Korea, he needs to have a willing partner in North Korea.
Right.
And I think he's started down that path. Clearly, Kim Jong-un also is interested and has declared that he wants to focus on the economy now that he's done with the nuclear component.
Right. He did away with his Pyongyang policy, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So let's see where this takes us. But again, there's this very sticky issue of sanctions. How do you get around that problem? And as the issues get bigger and as the stakes get bigger, how are you going to amass the capital and the resources to do this without violating the existing sanctions?
So unlocking the key is a Trump meeting and the subsequent meetings with other leaders. So I completely agree. This economic development or the cooperation has been talked about in previous declarations in sufficient details, and there are some projects that we didn't get to in abound. So I think that this time around, the summit meetings are in steps, in phases, leading up to North Korea and the U.S. meeting. So I think that these are all in calculation. I think that this is an opportunity not only for the North Korea, but South Korea as well.
Right.
So I think that there is a real chance that North Korea will be treated with, I wouldn't say respect, but
like a
because of
normal
their
state.
right,
Yeah.
because of the nuclear power. Before it was convenient to kind of dismiss them, but now we have to deal with them. And these economic cooperations or these deals or the projects seem more real than before because that becomes a real carrot.
And we're already seeing reports coming out on how there are high hopes now for a resumption of business at the Kaesong Industrial Complex as well as the Mount Kumgang tours. So hopefully we'll see some changes on that front once those sanctions are taken care of, I guess, in a big picture. But what was interesting was that there haven't been any mentioning today of North Korea's humanitarian issues. So are there chances that we could see the two Koreas discuss these issues in the future, in the near future?
Well, there's an ample possibility of having those issues surfacing because I noticed that they emphasize that they will adhere to all the previous declarations. And it's a convenient way of kind of bringing all these projects into a current state. And the reason why the 10-4 declaration is important is because in sufficient details, there are many projects there, including the denuclearization and the phased method, as they mentioned this time around too. So those are humanitarian aid. I think it'll resurface simply by mentioning that, well, we got to do what we have agreed before, and it's on the table now.
I mean, the humanitarian issue kind of did get mentioned around the issue of separated
Family
families.
reunions,
and,
which are going to be held on August 15th.
Right, as an inter-Korean Red Cross meetings. So they did kind of touch on it, but it's not the human rights issue that the global community is concerned with.
Right.
And that's the human rights violations within North Korea. And clearly that's a deal breaker. If President Moon mentioned that, I would have been very surprised if that was included in here.
Okay, so you weren't really expecting that?
No, we weren't expecting that at all. North Korea probably would not have agreed to anything in this if that was at all a condition for something like that. So I don't see this issue being handled anytime soon, even though it's a very important issue from an ideological standpoint and value standpoint. Especially for countries like the United States, which is traditionally focused on things like human rights as a very important issue. But President Trump isn't so keen on this. Clearly, there are other priorities here, and on the issue of denuclearization, I think it is really the key issue. And it's unfortunate that that's how it is.
Right.
You look at other places around the world, you could mention, we could talk about the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar. Why aren't we addressing that?
Right.
And there are many, many atrocities and human rights violations around the world that we're not addressing, that is overshadowed by other issues, largely because of, in the name of national interest. So on this issue, I think President Moon wanted to put the emphasis on inter-Korean relations, peace, and denuclearization. I think he did a pretty good job.
There's definitely a first thing first kind of element to it, but especially with Japan, there's the abductees and all those issues. I think that North Korea has to address some of the issues as a token gesture, even. But down the road, I think that this will become a big issue because if North Korea wants to be folded into the existing world order and system, probably that will be a pretty sticky issue.
Right, so definitely a lot of issues to look forward to, especially with the Trump-Kim summit still upcoming. But today was definitely a historic day for the two Koreas, so we'll see what the two Koreas do from here on out. What's important is what's next, right? So we'll definitely keep our eyes on that. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you.
Well, enjoyed the talk.
And that wraps it up for today with our special coverage on 2018 Inter-Korean Summit. But we'll be back tomorrow with more up-to-date news and in-depth analysis of today's historic summit between the two Koreas throughout tomorrow. So make sure to join us again then. Thank you so much for watching and good night.